Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Sun Dragon Tips and Tricks. I'm Rebecca. I'm the owner of Sun Dragon Art and Fiber in downtown Brevard, North Carolina. And I'm coming to you from my house today where I film on Mondays usually. So July started our crochet, our one crochet make along. We're doing about 4 this year, about every quarter. Our summer crochet make along for the shop. And we are doing it kind of centered around the idea of granny squares. I have a short list of patterns I've picked out, and I thought I would make a series of videos for y'all on how to make a granny square. So I think what I'm going to try is a video for each layer, each row, starting in the center and moving out with some of my tips or ideas or ways to think about granny squares to understand the process. So we're going to start with this very first one. I mean, something to just mention, a traditional granny square is square, and I'm going to talk about these little units in here. I'm going to call them mini squares. I mean, they kind of have a trapezoidal shape, but it's a way to think about little blocks that we are using to build the bigger square. The fun thing with granny squares is you only have to know how to do a double crochet and chaining, mostly, to make this work, which is, I think, is kind of fun. So let's go over some basics. Let's look at a few pictures and then let's get to it. This is going to be granny squares, how you start, and row 1. Let's definitely get to it. So here's what I've written up for a few basic things to keep in mind when you're making a granny square, things that might help you understand how to process them. To make granny squares, so we're doing this with crochet, they're combinations of double crochets and chains. That's really all we're going to use. I'm going to start off with something called a magic ring to get us started, but you can do this with chains as well. So double crochets and chains are really all you need to know how to use to make your classic granny square. There's a couple other skills that we'll introduce as we go when moving from row to row, things like that. But those are the basic building blocks. And each, what I was calling a mini square or a block, each little unit is made up of 3 double crochets. Get used to doing, and I'll see if I can outline this here, 3 double crochets next to each other, all going into the same space. All going into the same space between groups of stitches. That's another thing to get used to, is everything goes into holes and spaces between units instead of into the top of a stitch, as you might be used to doing with regular, like when you learned how to single or double crochet. The space that we're talking about, the space that's created between these little mini squares, between these blocks, depends on the pattern. Different pattern writers are going to recommend different spaces. Some are going to say you don't need any spaces at all. Like, by space, I mean putting a chain between your building blocks that we're going to be making. I like preferably 1 chain between squares and blocks that are going to be on the side of our squares. And I like 2 chains on the corners. Gives you just a little bit more space to turn the corner. Again, depending on the pattern, some will only put 1 chain between everything. Some will put no chains between our building blocks on the sides. The spaces will be created by where the blocks go into. I like the rhythm of 1 chain between squares and blocks on the side of a piece. And when you're turning a corner and you need to have an edge that looks like a right angle, eventually, I like putting 2 chains there. But different patterns will vary on this, absolutely. How many mini squares, both to start and as you get going, especially in the first round, depends on how many sides you need moving forward. A classic shape, a classic granny square, it's a square, so you need 4. But you'll have ones that will use 5. They probably won't call them granny squares, but they'll be built on the same idea. And you'll find ones that have hexagons as their building block shape of something modular that can be pieced together. The classic granny square is a square. And that's what we're going to build today. So you are always working in the round on a granny square. And what I mean by that is you're always going in a circle. I know we're creating a square. I was joking with my class that we just had on Saturday about that. What I mean by in the round is we're always building on the outside edge and going bigger. We're never flipping the work around in a classic granny square. The squares are built on the outside edge without turning the work. And a couple more things to keep in mind moving forward, which this won't so much apply to today, but there are things I want to mention. After the first round, after the first row around, corners are made by two mini squares, two of our building blocks into the same space, with chains in between those two things going into the same space. That will make a lot more sense when we hit row 2, but it's a way to keep track of where you are and what's going on. And the other thing is, as we build extra rows out, corners always go into other corner spaces. Geometrically, that's how it all works. If any of that is confusing, just hang on and build it as we go, either following the instructions of the pattern you have or looking at the visuals I'm about to give us. Let's take a look in a few more visuals before we turn to the actual crochet of what we're starting to build here. I'm going to build with geometric shapes, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like if you were following a crochet chart. Crochet charts will use a different set of symbols. So over here, just to show you with geometric symbols, which patterns probably aren't going to use this at all, but it's so we can kind of visually understand what is happening. This represents 3 double crochets into the same space, a square, and a line is a chain. So what I'm about to do with yarn, if we use a magic ring or chains, I'm going to show you magic ring, but some patterns may ask you to chain a bunch and then connect to the base of the chain. Either way, we're going to start with a little bit of a ring in the center, in the very center. Let me put that here, that this is going to be for us our magic ring. So in that magic ring, what we're going to end up having, remember we're building a square, so we're going to have 3 double crochets, 2 chains to turn a corner, and I'll make these maybe a little longer for our picture, 3 double crochets, 2 chains to turn our corner, 3 double crochets, 2 chains to turn our corner, and 3 double crochets, 2 chains to turn our corner, and we're going to do what's called a slip stitch. To combine them together. So I'm going to add, I'm kind of as I go so we can see these, because this just looks like a bunch of squares now. I'm going to shade them so we can see. We will have 4 blocks of 3 double crochets each with corners that are made up of chains, 2 chains each. Our first round may not look that square, but that is the idea we're building towards as we add more in. Now, if you were reading a crochet chart, let me also do that little magic ring thing. Here's how it might look if we had a chart, which still give us the magic ring. That first set of 3 double crochets, the first one, I always say you need to go up to go over in crochet. So it will probably have you chain 3 to get your height. And it will tell you to double crochet 2 more into this magic ring. and then chain 2, and let me get all my symbols in here. 3 double crochets into the magic ring, chain 2, 3 double crochets into the magic ring, chain 2, 3 double crochets into the magic ring, chain 2. And it might assume that you know that you have to slip stitch there, or it might have a symbol for it. So that is what a crochet chart of the first row might look like. Now, how to translate any of these visual images into actual crochet, let's do that next, because for some people this will make sense, and for some people seeing it with the yarn will make a lot more sense. So here we go. So on this granny square, we're going to take a look at what is in the very center here. This is how we start our granny square, is this purple layer right in the center. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4 little building blocks, and each one of them has 3 double crochets. 1, 2, 3. The spaces are going to get filled on other rows by other stitches. But let's just see how we start this. So I'm going to be building a block for my Ariana Cardigan while we're doing this. Kind of multitask as we go. So one way, I want to show you all the magic ring method, but if that way doesn't work for you, one of the things, like a classic granny square, starts with a slip knot and usually a chain 3 or 4. And then to make this a circle, you go to the base chain, you go to the first one you made, you stick your hook in there and you do a slip stitch, which is yarning over. And I didn't stick into that one very well, so I prefer to use the magic ring. It's weird when you haven't gotten used to it, but I really like it. You yarn over and you pull through everything, through what you push through and the loop on your hook, and that gives you a teeny tiny little circle. And now you can start putting stitches into that circle. And sometimes for the top of a hat, something like that, we would put like 15 or so in there, right? We could put a whole bunch in there, but notice if I pull on this, it pulls this a little tighter, but there's still a hole there. You usually have to go back and use your tail to sew that hole shut in the end, or just have, like, it gets really big the more stitches you jam in there. So what I like to do to start anything like the top of a hat or this granny square and have that be super tight. Now, I still have to weave my ends in, and even this end, I probably want to circle up through the base of all these stitches here to get it nice and tight and keep it tight. But there's a better chance and less work if you use a magic ring. So how I do a magic ring is I hold the tail between my thumb and like my first and second fingers. I'm going to wrap around those 2 fingers, and when I turn to the back of my hand, I want the working yarn that I'm wrapping around to go closer to my knuckles down here. And what I just did without even thinking about it is I went over my ring finger and I held it in place with my pinky. I'm going to show you that one more time. So I grab the tail with my thumb and these 2 fingers. I wrap all the way around those 2 fingers and cross over so it's further back on my hand, over my ring finger, and hold it in place with my pinky. I should say this whole magic ring I have a video just by itself on how to do this magic ring. So now I'm going to take these strands that are on the back of my hand, I'm going to take my hook, point it towards the ground. I'm going to go under the circle loop and over that strand that goes all the way towards my pinky, so I can grab that strand in my hook. And then here's the funky thing. I'm going to twist down and up. So I have not only pulled this strand under the loop, but I've twisted it so it is wrapping around my hook. Now, I find it super helpful to hold where all that comes together with my right hand. This big loop that's a little loose because I've been tugging on it, and the top of this ring that's around my fingers, I'm pinching with my first finger and my thumb on my right hand to the hook. So I can take my left hand out. I've got a big ring here, and that's okay. I'm going to let it be. I'm going to find my working yarn, which is not my tail. Get my working yarn. Big loop on my hook. I can always tighten it up if I want to, but I don't have to. This is a little awkward to manage, but really just pinch things in place so it doesn't come out. Make sure your tail's long enough. If it wasn't long enough, I would restart this whole thing. Working yarn. I'm going to get it on my hand and however I feel comfortable holding tension to work moving forward. For me, that's wrapping around my pinky, over my ring finger, and behind my first two fingers. I know that was fast, but I have another video on that. Now, I'm going to trade off so that I have a thumb and a finger from my left hand pinching this now, right under this loop. So I can just yarn over and pull through. That to me is what locks that in place, and I can tug it up if I need to. It still feels loosey-goosey and everything, but it is kind of locked in the loop that's on my hook. So I'm attached to that ring now. So now I can start building my units, and I can start building my granny square. Now again, you need height to make your round. So most patterns will tell you to chain 3 right now, and that locking my loop in place, I don't count. So 1, 2, 3 this is building my height, and this counts as my first double crochet. This counts as my first post. So to get my first block of 3 double crochets, I need to put 2 more into this big loosey-goosey space. It's going to feel really weird. So we yarn over, go in, pull up a loop. I know that, so let me do that a little slower. Because where you would normally for a double crochet go into the top of a stitch, we're just going into this big, huge open space. Don't worry about this. We'll take care of it at the very end. We need to put all of our stitches in here and then pull it tight. So yarn over, go into the big space and kick your needle up just a little bit so we can get the yarn into it to duck it back under. Notice I'm holding back down here. So I had space to go in, but now, again, since this is so big, all of this might feel really awkward to finish your double crochet of like, So I recommend moving your fingers up right underneath all these loops. So the closer your fingers are to the hook, the more control you have. So I can finish my first double, and I got to put another one in, so I slide my fingers back down so I can duck under, lay the yarn in the hook and pull it back up, and then again I'm just going to shift my fingers back up to finish my double crochet. And one thing I recommend when you're working in a magic ring, the stitches might want to slide, and they'll slide all the way out, and sometimes you might feel like you don't have enough space, even with this big huge hole, to fit all your stitches in. So whenever you can, with my left set of fingers, I'm going to grab the ring. With my right fingers, I'm going to slide my stitches over so they create that block. So now I'm going to chain 2. Remember, between every set of 3 double crochets, we either put a corner in or a side, and this is all corners on this first level. So I chain 2, that's my corner. I'm going to build another block by putting 3 double crochets into this space. So I slide my fingers down, so there's room for my hook to go in and grab a loop. And then again, this might want to kick up. Just try to tell it who's boss. Get 1. Slide my fingers out of the way. Slide all this over if you need to. 2. 3. Again, if I get my fingers under here, I can manipulate, I can wiggle, and I can make room to finish this guy. Now, when in doubt, slide them close to each other so you can say, okay, here's my 1, 2, 3. Here's my space. Here's my second set of 3. I'm going to chain 2. And notice where my fingers are. They're holding on to what I just made to give myself more control. Now I'm going to slip my fingers back out here so I can put another set of 3 double crochets into this big space. 1. Move my fingers to control how the stitch ends. 2. 3. Slide them up nice and close. If I pull them apart and count, I have 1 space, corner, however we want to call it, 2 corner, 3. I need 4 to make it a square, so I need another corner, 1, 2 chains. Slide my fingers over so I can get 3 more double crochets. I slide my fingers over to make space. I slide them up right under all my loops to finish my stitch. So I have side, corner, third side, third corner, fourth side. I need my 4th corner. I know it looks like, but they're nowhere near each other. What do I do next? Make your last corner, which is a chain 2. Now most instructions will say to slip stitch this to where you started. Right now we're too far away. One other thing you may have noticed is I was doing all of these stitches around both the ring and my tail, and that's totally fine. It leaves my tail where I have easy access instead of being over here somewhere. I can pull all this close to each other, and I can let go of my tension for a second so that I can pull this up tight. This is where the magic happens. I've got my tail in my left hand. I might hold the base of my stitches, not super tight, but I'm just holding them in place in my right. And I'm going to pull on that tail. And I'm going to pull until it's pretty tight. If you've got a really stiff yarn, you're not going to break it doing this. Just pull it up tight. That pulls that loop, that ring shut, so it's gone. It's magic. And now I can get my tension back again. And I can do my slip stitch to complete the 4th corner. Now, in my class on Saturday, we talked about we want to put it in the 3rd chain. It's right here. One way to find that if you're not sure, I mean, if you put it down here, if you put it somewhere else, it's not the end of the world. Another way to find it is we have the chain, double crochet, double crochet. If we look for the middle double crochet here, it is a post. And then I like to say it's got a hole that sits off to the right, so it looks like the letter P. If possible, we don't want to go into the top of that hole. We want to go into the chain next to it. So find the top of the stitch, which is right there next to my thumb. And then what we want is the stitch to the right of it. So I'm going to push in here. 1 strand, 2 strands, it's not the end of the world. A lot of this gets hidden by the next row. I'm going to yarn over and pull through this. And a slip stitch is you pull through what's the left on your hook too. It just smooshes everything really tight together. And now I have my 4th corner. And sometimes this looks really like a circle. It doesn't look like it has edges yet, like sharp corners. But this is the first layer of that granny square. We've got layer 1. And from here on out, we are only going to be using the spaces between our units of 3 double crochets to make this work. Thanks for joining us for row 1 of a granny square, round 1, however you'd like to call it. Your granny square might look a little round instead of square. Here is my first layer, and I'm really, if I pull on the corners, I can more see that I have 4 sides that are made up of these blocks of 3 double crochets. And in our next video, we will go over how to do round 2, either continuing with the same yarn or changing colors. So stay tuned for that one. We have just surpassed 10,000 subscribers for this channel, which is super awesome. So if you have not subscribed already, please consider subscribing or giving us a thumbs up or writing a comment or a question. That all helps all the algorithms and things, right? We do have memberships over here if you'd like to support the work we're doing, or you can go to patreon.com/sundragon. And memberships and Patreon or patrons get their names mentioned in the comments at the end, in the credits. And we're working on other ways we might be able to connect, but we haven't figured that one out yet. So as I always like to say, may your crafting be filled with joy and confidence. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.